There's a lot of interest these days on the comparison between internal combustion engine cars and electric vehicles on, greenhouse gas emissions, which one is best for the environment. Well, there's a new study out from CD Howe, and I'm going to be talking to one of the co-authors, Brian Livingston. He's a senior fellow, executive fellow with the School of Public Policy. And welcome to the interview, Brian.
Glad to be here, Marco.
Well, Brian, why don't we start with an overview of the study, please?
Will do. We did this study as a scenario, and I'm going to explain the difference between a forecast and a scenario because there is a difference. A forecast is where you start today, make some assumptions, work forward, and come up with whatever numbers you want to come up with. A scenario is exact opposite. That's where you start with a number in the future, in this case, a number in 2030 for greenhouse gas emissions for the transportation sector for passenger vehicles and freight vehicles, and then you work backwards to today and say, well, what assumptions do you have to make in order to make that scenario actually occur? But in my engineering days, we used to call reverse engineering. So that's what the study was about.
Gotcha. And what were the conclusions of your reverse engineering study?
The major conclusions that we made on the passenger vehicle side was that there has to be a significant, and I'll explain it, how much significant, a significant amount of electric vehicles sold in the intervening time between now and the year 2030. Specifically, we said in order to meet the greenhouse gas emission targets that the ECCC, that's Environment, Climate Change Canada, Department of the Federal Department in Ottawa, in order to reach the goals that they have set, in order to in turn reach the Paris Treaty goals for 2030, we came to the conclusion that the sales in the year 2030 of electric vehicles have to form about 70 to 75% of the sales of all passenger vehicles in Canada. And just to put a number on that, there's about 2 million, roughly 2 million passenger vehicles sold every year. 3/4 of that is 1.5 million. That's the 70 to 75%. And that's what I will call the headline conclusion of our study.
Well, that's very interesting because the federal government recently changed its target for EV sales to 100% of electric vehicles by 2035. Any thoughts on whether or not Canada can get to 70 to 75% of new vehicle sales to be electric by 2030?
Let me start by saying we weren't here to be a judge as to whether you will or will not reach these targets. Our whole purpose of our study was to say, here's what you have to do. And to be honest, it's up to the government of Canada and provincial governments, as well as the automotive industry, as to whether that will or won't happen. But I will give you some context so people can make some assessment, your listeners can make some assessment as well, because that's the whole purpose of our study, was to facilitate and to encourage discussion. As I said, that 75% is about 1.5 million vehicles, electric vehicles in total. Canada's share, if you will, of automotive vehicle sales is about 2%. In other words, for every 100 vehicles sold in the world, about 2 are sold in Canada. And so in order to get to 1.5 million vehicles, in electric vehicles in Canada, if you do the math quickly, you can see that's close to 70 to 75 million electric vehicles worldwide. Currently, as we speak, just to give you some context, in the year 2020, how many electric vehicles were sold worldwide? About 3.5, maybe 4 million, which is about, say, 3.5, 4% of the market share. In Canada, about 3.5% of market share was electric vehicles, and that's about 55,000 electric vehicles per year. So the bottom line, if you're looking at it in Canada and in the world, you got to go from 55,000 vehicles, electric vehicles in Canada in the year 2020, all the way up to 1.5 million electric vehicles in the year 2030.
Gotcha.
Again, that's kind of the headline issue.
Right. Okay. So big ambitions and tough, maybe a tough problem to solve. Did you look at medium and heavy duty vehicles as well? And any thoughts on those?
We did. We looked at medium and heavy duty vehicles are basically big trucks, freight. The heavy duty ones are the ones that everybody who's listening to this has seen on highways going up and down, the so-called 18-wheelers. They're called Class 8. The reason why they're called Class 8 trucks is because they have a maximum weight of 80,000 pounds, and that 8 and 80,000 pounds means it's a Class 8. And there's almost as much, not quite, but almost as much emissions from all those trucks as there are from passenger vehicles. And the reductions that the ECCC people have talked about, and our paper talks about the specific numbers, is not nearly as much, but they don't really talk about how they're going to get there. People who, some of your listeners may say, well, geez, I've heard that a number of truck manufacturers, Tesla and others, have come out with these so-called electric vehicle semis. But right now, there are none, very few, if any, that are actually for sale. If you're a big truck operator, you'd love to be able to buy these electric trucks, but they're not for sale yet.
Gotcha. Now, I've done a number of interviews with experts around the medium duty class. So we're talking about delivery vans, that sort of thing. And they've made the point that these are ideally suited to electrification because, they have shorter prescribed routes. They're you can bring them back to a central yard and charge them, so on and so forth. So they're prime territory for electrification. Any thoughts on those?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. The more predictable and short range vehicles travel pattern, the easier it is to charge them and the better they are suited, therefore, to electrification. Perfect example of that is Amazon, company we've all heard of. And they make, as we all know, millions and millions of deliveries every day. A company called Rivian, for your listeners, that's Rivian. If you Google it, Rivian is under contract to make thousands, and I mean thousands of trucks for Amazon. Unfortunately, the latest thing I saw a couple of days ago is that there will be some delays in actually getting those trucks manufactured. But that's the type of thing, you're absolutely right. That's the type of thing that would help in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions for freight trucks.
Anything on transit? Because we've done quite a few interviews with Jospa Petrunic, who's the CEO of QTRIC, which is the kind of non-profit that promotes electrification of transit in Canada. And there's a lot of interest in replacing diesel buses with electric, and diesel, you got to think that that's got to be a fair contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Did your study include transit at all?
We looked at it a little bit. But to be honest, you're absolutely right. Autobuses, as they call them, autobus in français, buses are for delivery people like delivery organizations like Calgary Transit and so on. Yes, they are going into electrification big time. What you mentioned a bit, and I said a couple of minutes ago, obviously buses have predictable routes. You can take them back to the yard or the garage, you can charge them up, and then you can put them back out on the route the next day. So that's a lot. But to be honest, the amount of greenhouse gas emissions for buses is not all that great. I mean, in terms of percentages, for all of transportation, it's maybe 2% or 1%. You were sort of alluding to it, and some people ask about this. What about those CN and CP freight trains that we see going down the tracks and here at night and so on? To date, that's difficult because, as we all know, freight trains weigh an awful lot. Those engines are very powerful. I'm going to sound like a little bit like an engineer here, Markham. The specific energy of diesel fuel is much higher than the specific energy of batteries, the lithium-ion batteries that you see in, for example, Tesla cars and so on. So it's going to be a hard hill to climb to get to get railway engines that are electric, because you'd have to have so many tons of batteries in those engines to make them work.
Yes, this is a little known fact to our viewers, but I spent 3 years working for the CNR while going to the university in Saskatoon, and worked on many of those locomotives. So I understand diesel locomotive at least a little bit from the guy who had to clean them, not repair them. I didn't engineer them. But anyway,
they didn't let you pull the lever to make the whistle go, did they, Markham?
At one point, I had a job where I actually had to drive them around the yard, and that was scary enough for my coworkers that I didn't last very long in that job. Brian, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
Glad to help. Nice to see you.